Senator Black, Ontario.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, I rise today to add my voice to support Senator Lankin's motion to establish a special Senate committee on systemic racism to conduct a review of systemic racism in Canada. Thank you to Senator Lankin and Senator Bernard for this initiative. And thanks also to Senators Magie and Moody for your leadership on this important topic of systemic racism. Thanks also to the many colleagues who have delivered very moving and passionate speeches in this chamber. Sadly, racism is deeply embedded in the history of our country and in all of our institutions. Racism in Canada exists in many forms, but two of the most pervasive in Canada are anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism. The creation of Canada, as we know it, came about through the colonization, forced assimilation, and widespread violence and extermination of the Indigenous peoples who lived here long before the arrival of European settlers. In the centuries that followed, Canada continued to subject Indigenous peoples to horrors that white Canadians have trouble fully understanding. The forced removal of First Nations babies from their parents over the course of decades, the residential school system which took children away from their parents and attempted to remove all trace of their heritage, language and culture while abusing and killing thousands of children. The murders and disappearances of as many as 4,000 Indigenous women and girls since the 1970s, and forced sterilization of Indigenous women, which still goes on to this day, and much more. Still today, Indigenous Canadians face unimaginable discrimination. Though they make up only 5% of our country's population, Indigenous Canadians represent 30% of those incarcerated. Numbers indicate Indigenous Canadians are 10 times more likely to be shot and killed by a police officer than white Canadians. In the past few weeks alone, we've seen two Indigenous people in New Brunswick, Chantel Moore and Rodney Levy, killed needlessly by police officers. How is that acceptable? Being Black in Canada also means dealing with constant discrimination. The topic of anti-Black racism has been center stage in recent weeks, sparked by the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Many in Canada would like to think that this type of racism does not exist here in this country, but it does, and it is pervasive. In Toronto, Black people make up about 8% of the population, but represent 37% of the victims of police shootings. And often, far too often, there are a few consequences for the perpetrators. Black and Indigenous Canadians are also much more likely to be stopped arbitrarily by police. Of course, the police are not the only Canadian institution mired in racism. People of colour have a much harder time when applying for jobs in Canada. In fact, visible minorities in Canada are 11% more likely to face discrimination in hiring than in the United States. In workplaces, 54% of Black Canadians and 53% of Indigenous Canadians face ongoing discrimination. Human resources in our country have not adequately addressed discriminatory hiring practices and racist workplace cultures. Even here in the Senate of Canada, I am aware that employees and even senators of colour face racism and discrimination. We have heard many eloquent and important speeches from our colleagues in the chamber in recent days on this topic. And I would again like to thank Senators Bernard, Moody and Magie for leading the charge on this issue, and Senator Lankin for bringing forward this motion. Like Senator Lankin, I was hesitant to speak on this issue at first. Like Minister Chagger said of herself this afternoon, I too can do better. As a white man, I've not experienced racism, and I will never fully understand its deep and harmful effects. However, I think it is important for us all to show our support for what is right. White Canadians need to use our privilege to fight for and with our Black, Indigenous, and racialized brothers and sisters. We need to be allies. I will be an ally. I'm very supportive of the creation of a special committee to tackle these issues. Do I expect that this committee will be able to fix centuries of systemic and institutional racism and discrimination? No. But I think it will be an important step in the fight against racism. Such a committee will be able to examine the many reports and recommendations on systemic racism that my honourable colleagues have outlined and that haven't been acted upon. It will also provide opportunities for senators to hear from Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians who need to be the ones leading the way, and from groups and organizations doing work on this serious issue. I look forward to that change. I thank you for listening. I know many people feel a certain level of discomfort when discussing this topic, but we must discuss it anyways, and we must keep discussing it and acting on it until change happens. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.